Hey guys, just wanted to take a moment to thank you for listening to SiDEBAR Forever. If you like the show, please subscribe to us at sidebarforever.com, as well as share episodes of the podcast on your social media. That way, new listeners can find us as well. For an American comic book creator, to be known both as a writer and an artist is to be an auteur, especially in the mainstream. As a matter of fact, the title, writer-artist, grew to prominence in the 1970s and 80s with such artists as Jack Kirby, Jim Starlin, John Byrne, Walt Simonson, and Frank Miller. Be it a miniseries like The Dark Knight Returns, or a multi-year run on the Mighty Thor, or the Fantastic Four, these creators, along with others, wrote and drew flagship characters at both Marvel and DC, and fans ate it up to tremendous sales and acclaim. However, the early 2000s saw commercial comics begin to shift away from the writer-artist. Superstar writers, quote-unquote, became the focus of fandom and publishers. And popular artists like Daniel Warren Johnson and Sean Gordon Murphy are still given the creative freedom of writing and drawing certain mainstream projects. But if one is interested in telling the entire story, then one usually does so with their own creations at an independent publisher like Image or otherwise. So, what brought about this sea change? How does the writer-artist approach to comic book making affect production? And will we ever again see a return to the cartoonist-like work ethic of the writer-artist in the mainstream? I'm Adrian Johnson. Swain is with me today as we unpack this topic to discover whatever happened to the writer-artist in comics. You know, recently I was looking through my long boxes, as I'm wont to do. And it just seems like I really don't have a lot of time to do that these days. But, when I was looking in them, man, I was looking over my stuff and it hit me, just something that, a thought I had rather, just in terms of like, what happened to like the artist writer? You know what I mean? Like the artist writer that really came to prominence in like the late 70s on through the 80s into the early 90s, creators like Jim Starlin or a Frank Miller, a John Byrne, these guys would jump onto mainstream books. Well, I shouldn't say jump onto, but they were put onto mainstream books and they had lengthy runs of like years in some cases. And, in the case of like Byrne, they would have multiple runs across both companies, and Simonson should be in there as well, obviously for Thor. But I was thinking like in the early 90s, that started to dissipate and you saw less and less of that. You saw more creators rather, just getting on to like special projects here and there, but really not committing to a year's run or whatnot. And I was curious as to one, why is that, in present day? And two, what were some of the conditions back in the day that allowed those particular creators to come to the fore and have those lengthy runs? You know what I'm saying? So I posited that to you, well, to the fellas here, and that's what we're gonna chop up here today, man. So yeah, man. Did you have any thoughts, Swizz, as far as like artists, writers, like starting from back in the day, like as far as like the late 70s is really where a lot of this stuff was birthed from?
Yeah. I think, and you're talking about like mainstream comics and like commercial comics, not necessarily like, an independent publisher or some kind of a boutique publisher. Yeah, I don't know, man. I mean, as far I can remember when I was a teenager reading comics, probably Frank Miller on Daredevil was the first writer-artist that I really became aware of. I was reading X-Men, and I knew there was kind of a brouhaha between Claremont and Byrne.
Yeah.
because John Byrne wanted to be credited as like a co-plotter or really like a co-storyteller, you know, and Claremont would push back against that. And that was the first I'd ever kind of heard of like the artist in comics, wanting to, kind of take, the reins as far as storytelling, the storytelling from the jump goes. But Miller was the first one where I was aware, like, wow, okay, this guy is doing, like, he's doing the damn thing on Daredevil.
Yeah.
I think, what was it, Roger McKenzie wrote that one issue?
Yeah. Well, he was writing several issues before that, and then it was like a sea change. It was like 157, McKenzie was there. 158, Frank.
Sir, it was absolutely like that.
Yeah.
Where it was like, oh, wow, it's on, And so much so that, well, like I said, that's when I really became aware of it. And so I started reading interviews with Miller, like in, Comics Feature or Comics Journal, whatever.
Yeah.
And he was talking about Will Eisner, who I may have kind of understood who Will Eisner was from the Spirit and, in the Warren magazines and, having seen those, but never really like going back and really looking at them.
Mm-hmm.
And then Miller talking about Will Eisner and all the homages in Daredevil to Will Eisner, and then realizing that Will Eisner comes from more of a cartoonist-like ethic, of writing and drawing, inking, and handling, crafting the whole story himself, the story being a singular vision from one individual.
Yeah, right.
Now, of course, Frank Miller on Daredevil, he had an editor that he was collaborating with. He had eventually Klaus Janson that he was collaborating with. And I think eventually Lynn Varley was coloring it, right?
She didn't color any of the Daredevils, except for like...
That's right.
The last few issues. The last couple issues,
Yeah. But I mean, he had some collaborators, but for the most part, the story was being driven by him. So I remember that, and I was like, oh, wow. And then in that same era was eventually when Howard Chaykin was commissioned by First Comics, and he started doing American Flag.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, okay. And I knew Chaykin as a writer and artist because, he was doing things in Star Reach, and he had done... he did a painted Cody Starbuck book. Maybe it was by Byron Price. I can't remember.
No, I think it was those Byron Price books. That was like Empire, The Stars My Destination,
the Swords of Heaven, The Flowers of Hell. Yeah.
So you might be thinking of, he did a Cody Starbuck in Heavy Metal magazine.
That's what it was.
Yeah.
That's what it was. And so... now I'm really starting to kind of get it. And then I'm all over the timeline. But then eventually John Byrne leaves X-Men and starts doing Fantastic Four. And he's writing and drawing Fantastic Four. It's like, oh, wow. And he writes and draws Fantastic Four for about 5 years, maybe 5.5 years.
Nearly, yeah. Mm-hmm.
It was about 81 to 86, something like that. It's 87, right in there. It was a good long while. And then I even remember, so like even another change was, okay, so Byrne is now a writer, artist in my head. And then Mike Mignola goes to Dark Horse and gets ready to launch Hellboy.
Mm-hmm.
And he gives Byrne the plot and asks Byrne to script it. So Byrne scripts like the first issue, maybe the first 2 issues or something. And he's telling Mignola the whole time, you're a writer. You've written the story. This is your story. You should just write it yourself.
That's right.
And then moving forward from there, that's what Mignola did. And then, now we have, years upon years of Mike Mignola, writing for the Hellboy universe and for, for other artists, Duncan Fegredo, whatever, as well. So I think but I don't know what the conditions were that brought that about, because when you and I were discussing this as a potential topic, you brought up the point that, for decades in the, in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and even the early 70s, artists were never allowed really to write their own stuff, very limited numbers. I mean, not like a run like what you're talking about. It's almost like that mirrors more what's going on today.
And the crazy thing is, when we were discussing that as well, and I brought up the example of, the big sea change, when you think about it, is in 1970, Kirby jumps ship from Marvel to DC. Carmine Infantino's like, okay, yeah, come on over here. Kirby apparently was like, look, I'm out. I'm helping to plot and create, in many instances, a lot of these stories and characters, but everyone thinks it's Stan Lee doing it, and when I'm having a hand in it, in some cases, a huge hand, so Carmine's like, come on over here and we'll let you do whatever you want. And I guess Kirby was like, okay, yeah.
All right.
Yeah, and Kirby came over there, kicked in the door, and it's announced on the front of the first issue that he took over on Superman's pal, Jimmy Olsen. Kirby is here. He's like, I'm here, dog.
Right.
And think about it, man. When Kirby got there, he created so much stuff that he was the writer and the artist of. Oh my goodness. He took over Superman's pal, Jimmy Olsen, of course, but then he created the whole of the Fourth World. New Guys, Mr. Miracle, Forever People, wrote and drew them. OMAC, wrote and drew it. Our Fighting Forces, wrote and drew it. You know what I'm saying? Commandy, wrote and drew it. Yeah, yo. So he went on a tear, and he had a couple of one-shots here and there that he didn't write, but he drew. Like Joe Simon, wrote a couple issues of Sandman, for him, revitalizing that character for a little while that the two of them created, from the Golden Age. But I mean, really beyond that, he created all this stuff while he was there. And I'm curious as to why other creators of his ilk, didn't try to follow that example. Like, you have them following, their certain wants outside of the mainstream, like Gil Kane. He had a graphic novel called Black Mark, a barbarian thing, if I'm not mistaken. And he had another thing called His Name is Savage, stuff like that. But nothing.
But that was the Savage book was in the 60s, though, wasn't it?
I think so, like very late 60s. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you see, the creators, they're like, they want to reach outside of, even if it's outside of the mainstream, and do their own thing. But that regular paycheck and, them having to just do the art and get, just keep the production flowing, not everybody is as prolific as Kirby, who was doing books on a weekend, and just pumping them out. And for the most part, as big as a fan as I am of Kirby, they were pretty good. There were some where you're like, this reads like a weekend book, yo. Yeah. But I still love this Kirby. But
right.
That's my boy. But it just got me to wondering, from that huge example of Kirby in the early 70s at DC, and also when he came back to Marvel, in the mid 70s going into the end of the decade, he still took over books where he was writing and drawing it. Like, he took over Black Panther, he took over Captain America, he took over, I think he actually drew the entirety of 2001: A Space Odyssey, in which there was a Machine Man. He created that, Devil Dinosaur. So it's like they were still giving Kirby, they said, just come on back on over here. And with your immense cartooning, and I'm speaking in terms of being an artist and a writer, you can really do some production here. And I'm just curious as to why more creators, around his age, didn't take that lead, but it was the young Turks coming up, like a Byrne, a Miller, a Jim Starlin, and a Walt Simonson, who were starting to embrace that in the mainstream, and they were eventually given the keys to the kingdom, so to speak, to, go forward.
Right. Well, keep in mind in terms of time frame, and and this may not track completely, but obviously Jack Kirby is the biggest fish in the small pond.
Yeah.
In the 70s, there is no John Byrne, there's no George Perez, there's a Neil Adams that's starting to come to the fore, but he's the biggest name. He and Stan Lee and maybe Steve Ditko are the biggest, most known names in comic books for whatever that meant in that decade. And a lot of his peers, he and his peers, I mean, think about like Kirby was 40 years old when he worked on the Fantastic Four. So he had already been working for 20 years, more than 20 years, but he was 20 something years into his career when he was working on the FF and all that stuff in the 60s.
Yeah.
So a lot of his contemporaries have been around a long time. And I've heard some of the professionals, I've heard, like Chaikin and other people who were after Kirby, certainly after Kirby, mentioned that a lot of those old school creators, some of them, it was all good. Others could easily be intimidated by the editors. They were still freelancing while they're into their 40s and their 50s. They had families. They were not trying to buck the system. They were not trying to push against things. They wanted to just keep things going, and they wouldn't speak up for themselves.
Yeah.
I think Neil Adams has even talked about that as well. They wouldn't speak up for themselves. And so, like you said, it took kind of the younger guard who came of age during the 60s and the 70s, became young adults during the, the eras of change and challenging the establishment, to come out and speak up. But you mentioned earlier Jim Starlin, and so he's kind of a prime example where in the late 70s you see him drawing Captain Marvel. I don't think he wrote Captain Marvel. I think he collaborated with someone else, maybe Steve Englehart or somebody like that. I can't remember. But he's drawing Captain Marvel, and then he starts writing and drawing Warlock.
Yeah.
And a lot of the themes in Captain Marvel and the themes in Warlock, it's space, it's existential, it's philosophical, it's otherworldly, very much in the vein of like a New Gods and that that kind of thing. And certainly Jack Kirby had to be. I can't remember from our interview with Starlin, he had to have been an influence on.
Oh yeah,
Starlin. And you see Starlin start to emerge in those late 70s going into the 80s as a writer and an artist. And a good one, too. Like a guy with really interesting, provocative ideas, and just like doing his thing. But, so I don't know. I mean, like you said, you do start to see the next guard after that, the people in the late 70s going into the 80s kind of wanting to do more. And I mentioned Howard Chaykin a second ago. He has never been short on pointing out the fact that, most of the writers in comics that he collaborated with, he found to be pretty crappy.
Yeah.
And he was like, he felt like he was smarter than they were. He was better read than they were. If they can do it, he can certainly do it.
And he did.
And he absolutely did. So.
Yeah. And, and the interesting thing about that too, Swizz, is, as these artist writers are coming to the fore, you see the sales start to rise. And I think the companies responded to that as well. It's like, okay, so we got this Miller kid on Daredevil and the sales and the success are increasing. The acclaim for this thing is increasing. Okay. Byrne, he's bouncing off of, he's coming off hot off Uncanny X-Men. He's asking to be put on, Fantastic Four. Let's give it to him and see what happens. And very successful, long run, for him, And then you also have Walt Simonson on Thor. People know him from Manhunter with Archie Goodwin. And so he comes on, and he did a few issues of Thor before he took over with 337, but once he took over with 337, that was it. It was on. For like the next 5 or so years. And that's what I'm saying. Like, you really don't get those creators who are having those lengthy runs, like, as an artist writer, like those guys did. And those runs are fondly remembered, I think, for the most part, because it's a unified vision, or rather a singular vision for the most part. The same person who's creating the plot and writing the script is the same person that's, drawing it or penciling it. It may not be the same person inking it, but it's the same person doing the bulk of the writing and the visual storytelling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to say, so we mentioned Kirby and Jim Starlin, John Byrne on Fantastic Four, and then later on like Superman and was it Man of Steel or Action Comics?
Both actually. Yeah, he was hot.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But other examples, again, mainstream titles or flagship characters. And in some cases maybe secondary characters, but Matt Wagner did Batman Faces. He also later on did Batman and the Monster Men, and he also did a Demon saga, and it was just like on the cover, it was just The Demon by Matt Wagner.
Yeah, he did like a 4-issue miniseries. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But Simonson we mentioned. Mike Grell is another one that you and I talked about before when we were talking about this topic. Prior to Green Arrow, the Longbow miniseries that he did later on, he wrote and drew Warlord.
That's right.
For a good long while.
Yeah.
He did for a good long while.
Catch.
Yeah.
Good catch.
And that's really when I kind of became a fan of him as an acolyte of Neil Adams in many ways. And then, he was a writer, and he turned out to be a very good writer later on doing like John Sable, which I really enjoyed. And then we talked about Dan Jurgens. And then also George Perez was working on Wonder Woman, and he was given the opportunity to write it like in the middle of the run. I forget what happened. The writer left or something.
Yeah, Greg Potter ended up like, something happened where they had to take him off, and then Perez took over. Yeah.
Yeah, and then Perez took over, and he didn't do it for too long, I think, before another writer came in and took over the script. But the interesting thing that I thought, too, and this ties into kind of talking about the Image Comics founders and what they were doing in the mainstream before they actually left to kind of start their own company.
Yeah.
Most of the writers and the artists that we're talking about, correct me if I'm wrong, they kind of worked up to, but not really into the speculator boom.
Yeah, well, like that first wave, so to speak, they were starting to have special projects outside of that. So there were some even younger Turks that were coming up.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Cue the Rod Stewart song, Young Turks. But yeah, so that's kind of what I was thinking is McFarlane and Larson and all of them, they're still working for Marvel. And what were they working on at Marvel? You said they were writing and drawing some of their own books, and in some cases, I think coloring and inking them too, or something.
That's right. Like McFarlane, obviously he came from Amazing Spider-Man, and I think he was eventually he was writing and no. Dave Michelini was writing Amazing Spider-Man, but eventually the success was really tied more to McFarlane, to where Marvel gave him his own Spider-Man title, adjectiveless Spider-Man. And on that, Todd said, I'll write, I'll draw it, I'll ink it. And then for a couple of issues, he even colored it. and them things is like, what in the hell are you doing? What? leave the Ben-Day dots alone. Leave that. Leave the Pantone colors alone, Todd. Stop it. But yeah, man, he was writing, drawing it, and inking it, And a lot of people forget, too, same thing with Rob Liefeld. Like, he started off with Louise Simonson was writing for him on New Mutants, but eventually it got to the point where he took over the writing duties. So he was writing and drawing it, and in some cases inking it. He had some inkers with him on there, but even still. And then Larson, he was writing and drawing Spider-Man, adjectiveless Spider-Man, after McFarlane left. After McFarlane retired, for about a year or so. So he was doing that. And then also, we were talking about on Uncanny X-Men where Byrne and Claremont were kind of butting heads about co-plotting and whatnot. Similar thing happened, on Uncanny X-Men with Jim Lee. He wanted more of the co-plotting, credit. And when Will Spertasio also took over on Uncanny also, They wanted more co-plotting. So they're drawing the books, but they're also helping to co-plot and create new characters for these storylines. Now, they're not out and out writing, but they're co-plotting, you know? And I think that led them to, well, we're seeing all the success that Marvel is having, putting our names on the books, putting us on Front Street, you know, to help sell these things. Shoot, why don't we just do it ourselves, you know? And McFarlane was already ahead of the curve, him and Liefeld, and they were, you know, forming up Image and got the rest of the guys to come along, you know? And so once they leave, there's this vacuum here that, you know, Marvel especially in particular, but also DC recognizes, like, whoa, we kind of have a talent vacuum going on here. You know what I'm saying? Like 7 of our biggest creators, you know, who were writing and drawing these books in many cases, they're gone. So that vacuum starts to be filled by, you know, either actual just writers, not writer-artists, not artist-writers, just writers. But you do have some that are still there in the mainstream doing it, like a Dan Jurgens, like you mentioned previously. You know, he eventually takes over on the Superman title, you know, on through Death of Superman and on through the, you know, rest of the decade, you know, for the most part, you know. But you'd be hard-pressed to find any examples, you know, in the early to mid-'90s and on through the rest of the decade of, like, artists, writers in the mainstream. It's almost as if, and this is conjecture, but it's almost as if the big two said, that's not going to happen again. No. That's not going to happen again. We're not going to have a talent vacuum like that again. So we're going to have just writers, just artists. We're going to make sure there's a delegation here and it stays strict.
So I was thinking about that, and this is my last Howard Chaykin reference, but kind of going back to what you were talking about before with the co-plotting.
Yeah.
You know, Chaykin has gone on the record as saying that the artist in comics is always writing. They're always contributing to the story. They're always adding to the narrative, making the story, pushing it forward, making it more propulsive, adding emotion, adding humor, adding drama, melodrama, adding excitement. You know, they're always adding things to the story, so they are always writing in much in the same way. Like if a writer says, okay, the character is 6 feet tall, has blonde hair, freckles, and a droopy eye. If you draw that character, they've essentially influenced the art,
right?
You know, by giving you that descriptor. So I mean, it's you can see how the two, you know, certainly commingle, and in the best comics, you know, that are collaborative, that's what you get. That's what happens. But I was thinking about that too, and I was like, okay, certainly after things crash, and like you said, there's this vacuum. That could have been the mentality, you know, by the publishers to say, hey, you know, we got to keep this from happening again. And maybe even partially too, to kind of get the lines of production kind of reestablished. You know, it may have just been more of a business decision as well, for the most part, maybe even to say, hey, you know, if you have somebody who's writing and drawing and inking one book and you lose them, now the book's already solicited, or the book is, you know, is promised in whatever amount of days after that. You've got to hire now 3 people instead of 1. So the idea of keeping those disciplines separate was probably what was driving comics during the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. It's like no, keep these all separate. That way we can keep the books on time.
Yeah.
If someone is an auteur and they're gonna write and draw and ink or whatever, well, that takes time. And you know, back in the day, it was always a page a day. You know, you can do like 1 book a month, 12 issues a year. I imagine now, and I could be wrong, but you know, most of the artists that I know seem like they're on more like about a 5 or 6 week schedule per book. So now it's maybe closer to 8 or 9 issues a year that they can crank out. And that's just drawing it. Yeah. That may not even be inking it. That might just be drawing the book. You know, so I'm not sure. But then the other thing, like you were talking about with the focus on writers, you know, somewhere probably maybe, I don't know, in the late 90s, maybe the early 2000s or right at 2000, is where we start to see more of the emphasis on writers.
Oh yeah.
And them kind of rising to, rising to prominence as the stars of the books.
Yes. Oh yeah.
And I don't know if that was on purpose. I don't know if that was just how it kind of happened. But certainly, like you said, everything stayed kind of separate after that. I mean, there are certainly examples of writer-artists that we can think of through those periods.
Sure.
There have to be. But at the same time, it's almost as if it was a cutoff point. Like from that point moving forward, they became fewer and fewer and fewer and far between.
And that is an excellent point, and that's something that I definitely want to kind of bring up. Like, what's the point of demarcation? Where we see that change start to occur. And something else that may have contributed to that as well on the editorial side is, consider this. Outside of like Joe Quesada in the last couple of decades, you really don't have artists who are editors, like there used to be. Or even editors in chief. Like, think about it. Carmine Infantino, artist, became editor, in chief over at DC in the early 70s. He brought Kirby over. Joe Kubert was an editor, over at DC, obviously in the late 60s on the war titles.
Dick Giordano.
Yes, thank you.
Orlando. Yeah, quite a few. Yeah.
Yeah. So you almost have like, there was a balance there. You had writers on staff like a Julius Schwartz and so forth they were able to corral the writers. But when it came to like the art stuff, you had art-centric editors who were able to say, no, this layout does not work for this cover. Look at the composition here and so forth, and I think because there was a lack of that, in the last few decades, you start getting more the editorial, more balanced towards, or unbalanced rather, towards writers, rather than, artists. And that may have contributed to the paradigm shift, maybe?
Perhaps so. But an example of an art-centric editor at Marvel would be Carl Potts.
Okay.
Started out as an artist and then eventually became an editor and, like you said, was calling the shots. So there's definitely a vacuum of that as well. Not a vacuum, but just definitely that's missing as well. Like, really, Quesada is really kind of the only real name that you can think of. As far as an artist who becomes like an editor-in-chief, and a creative director, etc.
Oh, hey, man, let's not forget about Mark Chiarello, man. Yeah, man. Former guest of the show, obviously a long-time illustrator, painter, comic artist in his own right. You know what I'm saying? And, he was the former creative director over at DC. I think he had actually become the senior vice president of art and design and the collected editions. But, even when he was the editor, you could see like his touch, on the projects that he helmed, so to speak, that he put together. And, he was one of those to where, he was putting together projects and he would put together like the best artists, the best, creative teams,
right.
He would make sure everything looked right. You know what I'm saying? As far as like it going out the door as a package, you know what I'm saying? So yeah, definitely. Let's not forget about Chiarello, man, for real.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. But, I don't know. I mean, it definitely did change. And I can kind of remember it, like, when I was maybe back when we started the podcast back in 2007, 2008. And I remember it was writers, right? It was Rick Remender. It was Jeff Parker. It was Matt Fraction and Jeff Johns.
Jeff Lemire.
Lemire. It was just tons and tons. Like, the writers were the stars. Bendis, Bendis' star was on the rise then.
Oh yeah.
I mean, in a big way. And a lot of those guys actually started out as artists. Rick Remender was essentially an artist when he got started. Bendis certainly was. He was doing his own comics, and that's kind of how Marvel found him. I'm trying to think of some
Brubacher,
maybe one or two others.
Ed Brubacher was an independent artist. Yeah.
Was he?
Yeah, and then he started writing stuff for Vertigo, and then he hit big with Captain America, and that was his mainstream thing right there. Yeah.
Gotcha. Well, I will say this. I think that the thing about the writer-artist And probably around the time of like Starlin and then getting into like, Byrne and Frank Miller, etc. It was such a unique thing at the time when I first started seeing it. I mean, it's hard to put into words, or it's hard to really kind of describe just how exceptional and sui generis it was, for the person who's drawing the book to all of a sudden be writing the book or writing a book as well. And in certain cases, like with Starlin, he would write for other artists.
Yeah.
And, Chaikin would, of course, go on to write for other artists and so on and so forth. But, the thing about it is, like, even now, so there are examples of, well, let's go back to the 80s.
Okay.
John Byrne is a popular artist. They want to keep John Byrne at at Marvel. Okay. People are coming for the art. They might stay for the story, but the art is the lodestone. That's the thing that's bringing them in, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, that was always my thing where I started to kind of see, like even in the 90s where I'd see some of the image guys and other people, and I was like, okay, this is pretty awful.
Hey.
You draw good, but this is pretty awful. So, that's why I really started to get kind of snarky about it back then, where I was like, okay, it's easy for an artist to say I'm a writer, but you never see the opportunity go the other way where the writer says, I want to start drawing my own comic.
That's right.
Anybody who can sit down at a keyboard at their computer or, back in the day, a typewriter and type can say they're a writer. But, you sit down at that drafting board or today at the Cintiq or whatever, and the tail of the tape is going to let us know very quickly whether or not you can draw or not.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So, if an editor says, hey, I want to get so-and-so on my book. Oh, he wants to write. Okay. He turns in the script. It could be great. You'd be like a Rick Remender or a Jeff Parker or whatever. You might, this person can actually write. Fantastic. It could be just okay, but if you're getting great art and that's really what you want, then you're going to let them write. Does that really make them a writer artist, or are they just, you know what I mean? Yeah. It's just a very easy set. It's much easier for for artists to say, I'm a writer than it is for writers to say, I'm an artist. You know what I mean?
And I get that. And I'm curious about that because, you have to think about it like this as well. Like already drawing a monthly comic book is an Iron Man, no pun intended, an Iron Man event in itself. You got to get out them 22, 24 pages a month. You're drawing well over 500, 600 separate images. Well, maybe not that many.
Right.
But it's a lot. It's a shitload of images.
Well, throw in on top of that, you probably got to do a cover.
Yep.
Or they may bring in someone else who's kind of like a stunt cover artist because you can't. What? I mean, you may not have time. You just maybe beat the fuck out. But the thing is the artist. I mean, aside from the story, the artist is wearing so many other hats. You've got to be the costume designer. You got to do hair, makeup. You got to co-cast the book. You've got to do set design, prop lighting. Design, character design, lighting. You've got to be the cinematographer. You got to wear like 10 different hats. So yeah, and that's why I'm thinking when you're talking about keeping the division of labor separate, it could just be a simple business decision. In business, let's say you want to have $1 million worth of revenue. Okay. Your best bet is to try to have 10 $100,000 customers.
Yeah.
That way, if you lose one, you still can keep the doors open and try to replace them, but you can live off of the $900,000 that's left. If you got one $900,000 customer and then one $100,000, guess what happens if the $900K customer leaves? You're shit out of luck. So it's much harder to replace them when all the duties, all the disciplines are being lumped on one person. What if they get sick? What if they go through a fit of depression because they get a divorce? What if they die?
Mm-hmm.
Then that's it. So you've got to replace all those people and try to recoup. And it's just tough to do.
And it could be, but I keep thinking of Byrne as the biggest populist example of that artist writer in the 80s. You know, obviously we know about Fantastic Four, but don't forget he was also writing and drawing a 2 years run of Alpha Flight. He was doing The Thing. He was writing and drawing that for a few issues. He was doing so much that you're just like, wow, how was he able to do all of that?
But keep in mind, now going back to what you were saying about Kirby, that's when this shit started getting a little wonky, yo. That's when it was like, the wheels on the cart start wobbling a little bit. Dude,
that grocery cart wobble.
You know, you get that buggy at the grocery store with the bad wheel on it and it starts shaking. Something ain't right. Something ain't right. So, you know, that's when, you know, and really and truly, like, that's when Byrne started really relying more and becoming quite a bit more formulaic than he had been in the past. You know, when he got into the Superman era, there was only about a thimble's full of difference between his formulaic approach and Kurt Swan's formulaic approach on the same character. Yeah, them panels were the same. Them shots were the same. You know, and that's really the only way you can do it. I mean, in today's market, you do have some guys and maybe gals, I don't know their names, but I mean, you've got occasionally you do have Francesco Francavilla or a Mike Norton who could draw and ink 2 books a month. Yeah. But them motherfuckers are unicorns, yo.
Yeah, or Mark Bagley as well. And I guess that's the crux of it, isn't it? You know, at what point do you reach to where you're able to, you know, be prolific enough, but formula starts to seep in? And I can only imagine as a artist writer, you know, doing these lengthy runs, how many times are you going to bring a certain character back? You know, how many times are you going to kind of rehash that storyline, you know, go back over it. You know what I'm saying? Right. Yeah, and that's one of the dangers as well when you're working on a mainstream book as an artist writer, is that especially today, now that more people are more savvy about the business of comics, it's like, well, I'm not creating a new character. No way. Right. Unless you offer me participation. Right. So I'm going to keep bringing back characters from the past. But it's like if you were to be the artist writer on Fantastic Four, how many times are you going to keep bringing back Annihilus or Doctor Doom? You know, Byrne did it tons. You know, because he had to get the book out. Yeah,
right. And I think also too, like, so let's say, you know, Byrne in the 80s on Fantastic Four, and then eventually on like Superman and Man of Steel, and all of that. We're still only talking about 20 plus years into the Marvel Renaissance, into the Marvel Golden Age, from the inception of Spider-Man and Fantastic Four. We're only 22 decades in, so that stuff is still fresh and vital, and you know, as soil to toil and put your own seeds in. You know, I'm putting my squash down, but I'm mixing the squash with the zucchini. I'm going to make a squash-kini. You know what I mean? Like, you know, that soil is still fresh. Yeah. Now we're even 20, 30 years past that now. So it's like, you know, Dwight has mentioned a couple of times on the show about how much he's enjoying Hickman's new X-Men. Yeah. I can only imagine, I mean, Hickman must have put all that shit in a blender, and then threw in some wheat germ, and then threw in something else. Because you're talking about Dwight, who is, like, you know, one of the biggest longtime X-Men fans of all, and he's super into the book. Yes, yeah. So Hickman must be doing the damn thing. And he's another one who started out kind of as an artist with Nightly News. And he actually did some anthology stuff for Marvel, I think, before he started just really seemingly just kind of writing, period. So, so I don't know, man. You know, comics is a, I mean, it's kind of trite to say comics is a visual medium. Of course it is. But, you know, the analogy to comparing it to film would be, and you and I talked about this before. Yeah. in a film, if you take away the sound, right? Take away all the sound. There are no subtitles. There's no, there are no cards coming in like the old silent movies to tell you what the dialogue is. You still have a film. It might be a pretty quiet, intimate experience, but it's still a film.
Yeah.
And comics the same way. If you take the words out of a comic, it's still a comic. But if you take the pictures away, it's just like a weird story without very much description in it.
Yeah, you're right.
You know what I mean? It doesn't feel like a comic at all when you take that part away from it. So, and the script in movies and the script in comics, they're never meant to be, finished documents that you read and cherish and, put them online and people download them, whatever. It's really just supposed to be, this is what I'm trying to say so that we can get to the finished product. It's just supposed to help everybody working along the way get to the finished product. So the colorist knows what time of day it is, so that the artist knows what time of day it is, so that the inker knows, what this is supposed to look like. And there's a reason why the jacket is supposed to look like tweed. So draw it and ink it so it looks like tweed. That plays into the story. Yeah. But so, the artist is super important. But so let's talk a little bit about some of the artists, the writer artists that we have today. And I thought about this. You and I talked a little bit about it, but certainly, Mike Mignola, starting back in the I guess the 90s. Yeah, very early
Hellboy?
90s. Yeah, very early 90s. And let me make a distinction. So you've got some writer artists who work kind of outside of the mainstream on special projects and on things. They're not on like Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Spider-Man, Thor. They're not necessarily on those books, right?
Right, yeah.
Or you have them writing for other artists to draw the books. So you have Mignola, who's an artist and a writer, but he writes books for people who work in the Hellboy universe. You have Becky Cloonan, who's probably, 15 going on 20-year veteran now in comics, and she's writing a Punisher book right now.
That's right, yeah.
Scotty Young, did the Wizard of Oz stuff. He did I Eat Fairyland over at Image, and he's writing a Deadpool book that Nick Klein is drawing. I think they're still doing it. I'm not sure.
Okay.
But I remember when it was announced, and I remember seeing it. Ming Doyle. Doyle is writing Constantine with Riley Rossmo.
Oh. Wow. Okay.
Riley Rossmo's doing the art, and she's writing the book. And then, and then again, like you've got James Herron who's doing Ultra Mega over at Image. We mentioned Rick Remender, started out as an artist and kind of writes. Jeff Parker was doing Agents of Atlas and X-Men. But, again, kind of started out pretty much as an artist, and now I think they both mostly kind of write now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I was thinking in contemporary terms, there are a couple of artist writers that, really spring to mind. The one that really springs to mind that I would say, in my opinion, had like a huge impact would be the late Darwin Cook,
Right.
I mean, he came in doing that Batman Ego one shot. And then the next thing you know, he's doing The New Frontier and pew, Supernova.
Well, didn't he do a Catwoman book with, was it Brubacher?
He did.
I know he did Selena's Big
Score. That's right. Was
that with Brubacher or did he write that?
I almost want to say somebody wrote that for him. Yeah, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, but he also
like you said.
He did a regular series. That's what you're talking about. Okay, you're right. Somebody did write the regular series for him, and then it was. But DC
Selena's Big Score was his, and then it was New Frontier, and then it was
The Spirit.
Later on after that, The Spirit, and of course the Parker books.
Yeah.
And then unfortunately, he passed, but he probably was the last really like true blue writer artist. Like he went on to continue to write and draw and write and draw and write and draw until his last, until his unfortunately his last day.
Yeah.
And even Scotty did He did a maybe about 6, 7, 8 years ago. He did like a Rocket Raccoon miniseries over at Marvel.
Oh, he sure did. Oh, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, and it was before the Guardians movie, as a matter of fact.
Oh.
It was before the Guardians movie, and but I mean, again, he's kind of works on his own projects, writing and drawing, and then seems like he's kind of starting to write for other people now. But I don't know, man. Another one, I guess, was
I was going to bring up one that I think a lot of people gloss over, unfortunately, is Cal Baker.
Yeah.
I mean,
absolutely.
Long run on Plastic Man, and other projects. And then obviously outside of that, that's all he does is write and draw his own material. Nat Turner.
Yeah.
The Bakers. Any number of things. Like, he's a one-man production crew. Yeah, man. Absolutely.
Exactly. And he's a guy that I think kind of comes, again, from that cartoonist-like work ethic.
Mm-hmm.
Like his heroes seemingly would be those kinds of creatives. But in addition to that, Daniel Warren Johnson, he did Wonder Woman Dead Earth, which was, I think, a 4-issue miniseries, and they collected it into a trade. And then Sean Gordon Murphy.
Oh, yeah.
Batman White Knight.
Mm-hmm.
Batman White Knight. Of course, Murphy has illustrated, a bunch of other things. And he also, wrote and drew Punk Rock Jesus for Vertigo. But as far as the mainstream, it was Batman White Knight, which I guess was like a special project if you're talking about a miniseries. And then former guest on the show, Trad Moore.
Oh, yeah.
Luther Strode fame and others. He did a short story in The Amazing Spider-Man, like an Amazing Spider-Man that he wrote and drew as well.
Ah, all right.
So there are examples of it happening, but again, it just seems like that division of labor just kind of maintains. And I can only imagine, like I said, it's got to be for business reasons that's the case. But I just got to say, man, I just remember as a kid, like, again, reading interviews with the Frank Millers and with the Howard Chaykins and the Jim Starlins and even the John Byrnes. And others too, Bill Sienkiewicz, wrote and drew things later on, after he left Moon Knight and New Mutants, he did projects.
Right.
Miller did other things after that where, he wrote Born Again for David Mazzucchelli. He wrote Batman Year One.
Right.
And then he actually came back and did Elektra Lives Again, as a standalone project. But there just was nothing like that because it was just magical to me. It was just really like, and I guess for myself as a young, kind of wannabe artist, I loved comics, but I was like a big Mad Magazine fan. So I knew that, Don Martin and Dave Berg and Mort Drucker, they were writing these stories with these gags and, Charles Schultz. I was a big fan of Charles Schultz and King, Bill King.
Oh yeah, Family Circus.
And Family Circus. I was a big fan of that. So when I started to see that happening in comics, that's kind of what I thought. I was like, oh, it's like cartoonists. It's like these guys are cartoonists. And I don't know. I mean, maybe I was over romanticizing it, at the time, but I remember feeling that way and feeling really kind of, elated by the idea that, that the writer and the artist were one and the same. And of course became a big fan of Will Eisner, along the way too.
And the thing too, Swizz, is that a lot of those runs, many of those runs, done by the artist writer still hold up very mightily. And I don't know if I would put my finger on exclusively because it's coming from one person as far as like the storytelling and the scripting, but there is something to that, maybe there is something intangible, that I'm missing, but there is something to that. Like earlier today when we were, before recording and, we were talking about Kirby, just to kind of get our facts straight and everything. Man, I went to my box and I got out my whole thick section of Kirby, and I have nothing but Fourth World, all of that early 70s stuff, DC stuff for Kirby. And bruh, I gotta tell you, flipping through those pages, it's like you can see the power crackle off of him. You know, you can see like the breadth of his talent. You know what I'm saying? And I get that same rush when I read, like, I can't tell you how many times I've read Miller's Daredevil. I can't tell you how many times I've read like Byrne's Fantastic Four, all them joints, all them issues. And they still are fresh. They still are like, man, they like a warm bowl of macaroni and cheese. Just some comfort food. It's like, yeah. This is oh man, this hits the spot every time. And I wonder if in some way it's because of that storytelling visually and the scripting coming from that one person for the most part over a long run. So you have a chance to start a storyline here and pay it off in 12 issues. You know what I'm saying? And you can see them grow and mature in print. Their writing gets better. Their composition, their storytelling matures, you know, and you just don't find a lot of that in contemporary comics where you basically have to come to it fully formed. You know, you could do stuff outside of the mainstream, you know, independently or whatnot. But when you hit the stage, there's no time to grow up in print. You got to come to it, bam, print ready. You know what I'm saying? Right. Showtime, baby. And there's just something to that. There's just something to that, to seeing like those artists, writers back in the day being so precocious. It can sense them page by page, issue by issue, feeling out their talent. You know, they know that they can draw a bit, but finding their sea legs on the writing, it was just a magical thing to see. And it still is, man, for real.
Yeah. And the thing is whether you're a solo creator, you know, you're a person who gets on stage with an acoustic guitar and a microphone and you sing, anybody who endeavors to do anything creative can fail.
Yeah, oh yeah.
But certainly there's just a cohesion that you just have to pray actually happens when you're collaborating with other people. That's why so many films fail. You're talking about 100, 200, 500 people all trying to collaborate to make one vision. How does that even happen? So the fact that we get good films that come from that mode is almost in spite of the process, because you can hardly get 5 people to agree on anything, let alone 500.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because everybody's got their own agendas. You know, some people it's a paycheck. Some people I'm trying to just whatever. You just never know. And so in comics, you know, perhaps it's a thing where, you know, under the best circumstances, you know, the writer and the artist and the inker and the colorist are all working towards the same vision, and you do get something really spectacular, like what you got on X-Men with Claremont and Byrne and Terry Austin and, you know, the various colorists that worked on the book. But maybe what you're thinking about in terms of the solo person is, let's say if it's just one person who's writing and drawing it, maybe subconsciously, maybe on some, you know, some other level, you're getting more of a sense of who they are because they're doing more than one part of the process.
I think so, yeah.
You're getting more of a peek into John Byrne's brain as a writer and an artist than you would if he was just the artist. Mm-hmm. You know, same thing with Frank Miller. You know, we got a peek into Frank Miller's brain. In some cases, I don't know.
Yeah, you're right. I can't front. Yeah, you're right.
But you know what I'm saying? You're like, oh, maybe it was better not knowing. Shit. But you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You truly, like for instance, with a Will Eisner, you did get a sense of who Will Eisner was because he was writing and drawing. He was telling the entire story himself. Now that could be a good thing, or that could be like a piss poor shitty thing. You know, I don't think George Perez was the greatest comic writer in the world for the short time that he wrote on Wonder Woman, but he did it.
Yeah.
You know, and he got through it. So, and even like some of the Image guys, I mean, some of them created great characters that live on today. Some of them wrote great stories, you know, and then some of them wrote crappy stories. You know, it just doesn't work out for everybody. You know, even though they were all at the helm, it was like, okay, you know, using my my point a minute ago. We got way inside Rob Liefeld's brain. Was that a good place to be? I don't know.
Just one long guitar solo.
Yeah. You know, I don't know. You know, one big long underwear ad, you know, with a surfer dude. You know, I don't know. You know, so.
That concludes this episode of Sidebar Forever, hosted by Dwight Clark, Swain Hunt, and Adrian Johnson. You can find us online at sidebarforever.com. Any emails or questions can be directed to us at sidebarforever@gmail.com. And also, subscribe to us on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram.